Welcome everyone to the next webinar in our ThinkStep webinar series. So today we'll be hearing from Alison, who's CEO at ASBEC, so the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, which is a national forum of peak bodies all seeking to decarbonise the sector. We've done a bit of work with ASBEC, looking at the embodied carbon of the Australian built environment, and through that produced an issues paper and a policy roadmap. So Nicole from ThinkStep, our Impact Director, will also be going through our involvement in those projects today. So I'll hand over now to our first speaker, Nicole, who's our Impact Director at thinkstep-anz, to walk through a bit about how the project went and ThinkStep's involvement. So Nicole, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much. Absolute pleasure to bring this to you today, and really excited by the fact that there's so many people who actually haven't seen this work, and it's a really good message to be able to share. You might know from other webinars that we've done and things like that, that at thinkstep-anz we've worked with quite a lot of organisations on embodied carbon, so ASBEC, but also organisations like NABERS, Infrastructure Australia, GBCA, NZGBC, and on the acronyms go. The reason that we work with these organisations is we like to work on really sticky problems with organisations, ones that don't have a really easy answer or necessarily a linear process to go through them. And so we work with those organisations to work and understand their stakeholder needs, where things are at globally, and then formulate solutions that are practical and pragmatic and something that can really make a difference. That process starts with, of course, defining the problem. We need to understand what we're trying to address. In this particular one, we're talking about embodied carbon within a project. So we're looking at the built environment specifically, and there is a whole life cycle of a building or infrastructure, so any kind of asset in the built environment. But what ASBEC and others are doing at the moment is really focusing on upfront embodied carbon, that first part where we're focused on the things that we can impact now. So the decisions that we make in construction today impact and lock in the emissions that happen at the start of the life cycle. We have the power to make a difference and to make different choices. And also it has a big impact. So this is from a report that we did with the GBCA, Green Building Council of Australia, back in 2021. And in that report, we looked at what would happen if building materials didn't decarbonise and all that happened was the grid transitioned to being 100% renewable. And what we found that embodied carbon, the sort of lime green bit, would go from 16% of built environment emissions up to 85% of built environment emissions by 2050 if building materials don't decarbonise. And what that looks like in terms of the trajectory is you can see the darker colour descends like a slippery dip because we modelled the grid as decarbonising, but the bottom bit, that lime green bit, is actually slowly creeping up as the line shows that the area constructed is increasing. So we need to make sure that we're focusing on embodied carbon, because even by 2035 on that graph, you can see that they were projected in that report to be roughly 50-50. So what's so hard about this? What are the challenges that we're facing? Well, what we did is we went through all the consultations that we've been involved in over the past few years and discussed that with a group of stakeholders, and particularly ASBEC's steering committee, and pulled together an issues paper that was released in June last year. In that issues paper, we laid out research that we had done, and we laid out a set of challenges that we felt the built environment needed to tackle based on that feedback we'd received before. Those challenges we called our 7 decarbonisation dilemmas, because there's nothing like a bit of alliteration to make you smile. So the first one of those was direction. So about getting direction from a regulatory perspective or from companies in tenders and contracts to make sure that we understand how it is required to bring lower carbon construction to the mainstream. On that mainstream bit, that's incredibly important. When we're talking about decarbonisation, we're talking about the whole built environment. This isn't just green building. This is all of the built environment as it stands today. Secondly, to develop industry capacity to decarbonise, the knowledge and the skills that industry needs to be able to keep moving forward. The third is disclosure. How do we continue to reduce if we don't know what a benchmark is, if we don't know how to measure consistently so that we can compare what we're doing now to what we did before. So it was about developing standard methods as well as the data and reporting associated with that. The fourth was demand. So manufacturers of building products are crying out for clarity, consistency, and confidence in demand. It's all very well to say we want lower carbon building materials, but unless there is a consistent demand that they can build business cases for, it just doesn't work. Design came up as a really important issue, and that was number 5, making sure that we're making the best decisions to lower embodied carbon all the way from concept of a project all the way to completion, not just when we get to procurement and value engineering. The detail is about making sure that we can choose the best product options, supporting that with appropriate standards and templates to make sure that we can achieve the best that we can. And the seventh rather, is of course to delivering lower carbon assets, because we can put all of the rest of this in place. But if we're not going to actually deliver on the things that we're talking about, in the end, it's quite meaningless. We did research after the issues paper was developed to see how quickly does this built environment need to decarbonise to meet our commitments according to the Paris Agreement. And this graph is frightening. If you have a look at that middle line there at 2035, compared to 2020 on the left, we need to have decarbonised the whole built environment by 60 to 75%. Now that's particularly frightening because we know this is really hard for green buildings. When there are things like Green Star that are going through, it's really hard to achieve more than 40%, for example. We need 60 to 75% by 2035. And this is for the whole built environment, every house, apartment block, shopping centre, office tower, road, railway, bridge, airport, you name it. All of the infrastructure and buildings need to meet this target in order for us to have a chance of meeting the Paris Agreement. What's even scary, you can see there's like this broad green line there. It's not just that little blue one in the middle. That broad green line is actually trying to represent that when we build something, the day we design it isn't the day that we use the materials and build it. So if we want to achieve 60% by 2035, actually, if you follow that green band back to the left, at about 2032, we need to be designing for a 60% reduction. So this is coming on us really quickly. That's only 7 years away. Some building cycles can take longer than that. But we can't rely on materials to get us there. It's all very well to jump up and down and say, we need materials to decarbonise and give us lower carbon options. But honestly, it's just not possible at the quantity, intensity, and scale that this needs to be delivered in that time frame. The technology and infrastructure that we have to generate buildings just does not allow that. Yes, there are some lower carbon offerings, and we need to take them up where we can. But across the whole built environment, there is that gap that is being shown there, and we need to have other ways to address it. Now, the question is, what's the solution? Well, we looked. We did a lot of research around the globe to see what regulatory and programs were in place to see what other countries were doing, what are other jurisdictions doing to drive down embodied carbon. All of this information, by the way, is in the issues paper and in the annex to the issues paper from the research that we did. We did an overview of leading countries and what they were doing to drive down carbon in the built environment. And there's a lot of countries doing good things, but they're all different. They have different rules, they have different standards, they have different focus areas, they have different methodologies, and they don't align. And so the easy answer for us would have been pick a winner and follow it. But there really wasn't a winner to follow. So we had to look harder. So what is the solution? Well, we knew that global alignment just doesn't exist. And there is no perfect answer. There's no silver bullet that would solve everything. The other thing that we heard in consultation is that different approaches across Australia are slowing progress. So just like there's this incredible diversity internationally, in Australia, by states or even local governments, let alone private enterprise, they've all got different asks, different requirements and different timings. And that's really slowing progress in terms of manufacturing knowing how to respond. One thing that we did notice is that stakeholders are clear on what they need. So we published a consultation report that explains what the stakeholders required. We took all of that consultation feedback and we compiled it into a stakeholder consultation report. It's available on the ASBEC website and also on our website. Here are just some of the comments from within that report. There are many, many more. The things that stakeholders are asking for are things like bold policy measures, talking to industry, focusing on EPDs in terms of reliable measurement, alignment and harmonisation. This consistency thing comes up time after time. Clarity and consistency around policy, clear and concise education, making sure what's specified is installed. We heard many times that companies are specifying a certain product, but then it actually gets substituted out. And what was a low carbon intention isn't necessarily a low carbon delivery. We also heard that design and reducing embodied carbon through design is incredibly important. That actually there are many options that can help to reduce embodied carbon right back at the start of the project from concept. And many of those options are missed if they're not taken up at the beginning. We're also told we should be looking to try to build less and to use alternate options where we can, to make sure that we're using renewables, using materials to their highest purpose, doing the best we can, using more recycled and waste materials, and incentivising the supply chain to change. And that was only a snippet. There's much, much more, which is in that consultation report. We then worked with ASBEC to take all of this and to support them to create solutions or proposed solutions that can really help to advance the position for the built environment in Australia. And ASBEC then took that and consulted with their many stakeholders to make sure that there is an industry-agreed unified approach that is now presented as a policy roadmap. And now I'm going to hand over to Alison, who's going to explain the key recommendations in that policy roadmap and how it actually is possible to make a really big difference in a short period of time by following the recommendations of ASBEC. Over to you, Alison.
Well, thank you, Nicole. Now you should hopefully see my presentation up there on the screen. So fabulous, really excited to work with the ThinkStep team on this really important project. But lovely to hear as part of the poll, many of you in this webinar may not be as familiar with ASBEC. So the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, we are a member organisation, but our members are not people or companies. Our members, peak bodies in the built environment sector. We also enjoy a really collaborative relationship with government and academic observer members. But our role is to bring together a very, very diverse range of interests together with the common goal of sustainability and really nut it out, have really robust discussions about what a common approach should be across the sector. So very, very important, especially when we're talking about a subject like embodied carbon. So Nicole started with a bit of a why around embodied carbon in her presentation and gave you a few statistics. I'll bring up a few more to talk about the why before I launch into the results of our comprehensive policy framework. So one of the reports that ThinkStep collaborated with Infrastructure Australia on was a bit of a baseline. So like Nicole said, from an Australian point of view, we need to know at the very basic level what our carbon intensity is now in relation to upfront embodied carbon across the sector. And it's one of those things that we found out as we were going into this project process. You know, we originally had a focus on buildings. You know, it was driven by the work of NABERS and their work in commercial buildings. But we found that from an embodied carbon perspective, this is a sector-wide thing. Whether you're talking about buildings, whether you're talking about infrastructure, we all tap into our same supply chain. So the mechanisms that we need to look at need to be able to talk to all sectors of the economy. And there's a bit of a breakdown of what we're looking at in terms of embodied carbon. We also recognize that, you know, Embodied carbon occurs throughout an asset life cycle and or relife, but we recognize that upfront embodied carbon is a good, 70 odd % of the asset life cycle. And so it's got the most immediate opportunity to reduce and look at mechanisms to reduce the emissions in the extraction and manufacturing processes, the transport and construction processes. So the A1 to A5, as Nicole had in one of her earlier diagrams. So again, as Nicole mentioned, we went through a comprehensive process where we were standing on the shoulders of giants. So we took all of the existing research and analysis that was out there prior to ASBEC taking this on, and we used this to inform the issues paper that was released at the NABERS conference back in 2023 now. So the issues paper was really important because it helped start that conversation about what needs to happen across the value chain. And we received a lot of really interesting insights from our conversations with stakeholders, and it helped us understand and evolve our perception of what this challenge was like. We also, during the consultation, there was some amazing advances in policy in infrastructure. So at the time, Infrastructure New South Wales had released its decarbonising infrastructure delivery policy. So there was a really great opportunity for ASBEC to align with what was happening in the infrastructure space and ensure that what we were talking about in relation to buildings matched and aligned with what was happening in infrastructure. So a really great opportunity, and that resulted in our comprehensive policy framework where we do look at all of the different types of elements of the built environment. So again, that's how our comprehensive policy framework was born. And harking back to a slide that Nicole had earlier, we outlined that, using a very sort of simple trajectory in reductions and noticing the design versus construction lag, we did put out to industry that we really need to be aiming for a 60 to 75% reduction in embodied carbon by 2035. So we're thinking about all our NDCs, but we were very, very aware, and throughout many of our conversations with our manufacturing interests, every single manufacturing sector, every single material sector is on their own decarbonisation journey and trajectory out to 2050. They need to be supported and they need to happen. But we did recognize that if you take some of the big, the voluminous materials used in our sector, it's going to take them a little bit longer to decarbonize because they're still working out the right solutions. So by 2035, we cannot rely on material substitution alone to meet our targets. We know that the Infrastructure Australia work looked at, direct materials substitution with available materials. That would get us maybe just over 20% reduction. We need to aim more. So how do we do this, and what can we implement right now? We developed a range of levers. These levers, solutions that we can employ to reduce embodied carbon. So on there on the screen, like we say back in the issues paper around the design aspect from concept, the concept to completion. Concept is where we're looking at planning and procurement. There's at the very, very design stages, at the very early concept stages, they are the most tremendous opportunities to reduce embodied carbon or upfront embodied carbon. So being a lot more cognizant of the problem you are trying to solve, the options you have in front of you to plan better, design better. These are really important levers to reduce embodied carbon. We also recognise that building design and material efficiency, even something as straightforward as housing size, the smaller we're building, do you need that extra rumpus room when you're building a new house? These are really important decisions around whether or not you have the ability to reduce your embodied carbon. So, a lot of opportunities there to reduce. The blue lever relates to our materials supply chain. So absolutely supporting them on their own decarbonisation trajectories to ensure that we have and reward these low carbon materials or zero carbon materials and have a market for these materials. So that needs to happen at the same time just as much. And the whole A4 to A5 processes in the building life cycle or asset life cycle, fossil fuel free transport and construction, again, that needs to happen, and there are some really clear wins. The important point about the levers is that the composition of these solutions and the extent to which they influence our embodied carbon reductions, they will change over time. So, we need to go hard in the early years to reduce emissions through better building design, through material efficiency and planning mechanisms, but also set in motion incentives that will help our supply chain decarbonize. But as we sort of move past 2035, we are hoping that the decarbonisation of our construction products and materials and their supply chains will generate more substantial emissions reduction opportunities for the sector. But again, I think out of every policy that we've seen in the last couple of years around reducing emissions in the built environment scope 3, it's the earlier you looking at carbon in a concept or a project, the bigger the opportunity, the bigger the potential for carbon reductions. So this is really important when we're looking at skills and capability building to target those professions that do have the ability to make decisions that can dramatically lower carbon right at the outset. So I will spend a bit of time on this particular slide. So ASBEC, we got all the amazing work brought to us from ThinkStep with the preliminary recommendations based on the consultation. We had a lot of sessions with our industry and government partners across buildings, across infrastructure, to come up with 8 priorities for government at all levels and industry to start right now, working together and continuing the momentum over the next decade. So these 8 priorities that we are right away, we can have these discussions right now. We know that there is an update to the trajectory for low energy buildings, hopefully this week at the Energy and Climate Change Ministerial Council, looking at that trajectory. This trajectory helps set a tone for the built environment or for buildings and potentially look at the levers that need to happen to reduce embodied carbon. We know that the infrastructure sector also needs a common policy across the country, a common policy ambition around the reduction in carbon and a consistent policy approach across the sector. So that needs to happen whether or not you're looking at buildings or infrastructure. It needs to be nationally aligned, and we need to be, singing from the same song sheet. In tandem, we also need to be continuing investment in our tools. So we have the NABERS tool and common approach. There is the approach and measurement methodology agreed throughout ITM, so the Infrastructure Transport Ministers meeting. We need to ensure that the tools and databases and common frameworks are invested in and maintained so that all of our built environment sector can continue to use the same thing with the same outcomes. As a very, very big no-brainer is the support for Australian manufacturers. We need to ensure that they given the right drivers to reduce embodied carbon. That's, a positive, in the terms of investment for their own decarbonisation processes, but also the ability for them to understand the carbon impact of their processes. So, processes like environmental product declarations, third-party verified carbon assessments, that's what you're looking at, because unless you understand your impact, you can't make change, make positive change. So it's just about our, as if we own a building or if we own an infrastructure asset, our scope 3 is the manufacturing sector's scope 1 and 2. So everyone working together to reduce these emissions. We also recognise that what we can do right now is prioritise that reuse or retrofit first processes in our planning mechanisms and decisions. And that really embodies the elements of circularity, keeping assets at their highest level, assets and materials at their highest level of use for longer. Really needing to adopt these behaviours and processes at the outset. We also recognise that minimum standards need to be set. We need to have government lead in their procurement processes and really drive and create those markets for low carbon behaviours, whether it's low carbon materials or low carbon and fossil fuel free transport and construction processes. Another no-brainer. Skills, capacity and awareness. All of these elements, if you think about the built environment value chain, we really need to focus on upskilling all of our professions. It's not just the sustainability team that needs to think about this. It's procurers, it's decision makers, it's everyone along the life cycle and re-life, or even the value chain. Everyone needs to be aware of the consequences of the carbon consequences of their decisions. Then we had a few industry or segment specific recommendations around the National Construction Code and the need for signalling and understanding about the mechanisms and giving industry time to adjust, whether it's the commercial sector or the residential sector. And then the last recommendation is around that level playing field for manufacturers. So it's the level playing field to ensure that we don't have carbon leakage, but it's also a level playing field in terms of understanding life cycle assessments. So we want to be able to understand, compare like for like in terms of delivery, like EPDs or other third-party verified assessments. We need to ensure that they're saying the same thing. So each of these recommendations, we go into the paper, they each have the ability to pull different levers. So the levers are color-coded throughout the document. So the levers related to the recommendations in the way of being able to take the opportunities and get the change that we need in each space. So I recommend you read if you're interested in any of the recommendations. I also recommend you read at the same time ASBEC also released via our Infrastructure Net Zero initiative, report around understanding what net zero means in terms of infrastructure. This unpacks, we're talking about scope 1, 2, and 3. What does that mean? How does the scope 1, 2, 3 reporting relate to what we're talking about in relation to PAS 2080 and the managing of carbon reductions at every life cycle stage of an asset? So I recommend that if you're interested in the infrastructure space, you also have a look at this report because it helps to unpack how the scopes and the greenhouse gas reporting aligns with carbon reduction opportunities at the different life cycle stages. So that's another really great report that I encourage you all to read. And that's it from me in terms of a summary of the report. Very happy and looking forward to answering the questions that you have. And here's some QR codes up on the screen, just in case you haven't seen all the amazing links that Emily's been sharing with you all.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alison and Nicole, for taking us through all things ASBEC. I was involved in the project a little bit, but even that was a lot of new information for me. So I'm sure all our audience did learn a lot from that as well, which is fantastic. We have a few questions now. So we've got this first one here from Eva, who asks, can we expect the projected embodied emissions to be similar in transport infrastructure? Nicole, did you want to answer that question?
I will. And if you can pop a link in the chat that I just sent you, please. In the Infrastructure Australia report that they released, I think it was, August 2024, they actually reported on embodied carbon emissions across the whole built environment, or upfront embodied carbon emissions particularly as the focus. So out of our whole national footprint, 10% of our national footprint are embodied carbon emissions. with almost 7% out of the national footprint being upfront carbon in the built environment. Out of that 7% of upfront carbon, which represents the whole built environment, 27% of that is represented by transport infrastructure alone. So when we're talking about building roads and bridges, this is where we're at. And 27% of transport infrastructure also includes rail, is the built environment upfront carbon in Australia. So it is very significant for transport. The other numbers there, 59% is buildings and 15% is just in utilities. So, we're talking like power lines and things like that, 15%. So also quite significant. So yeah, very, very similar for transport.
Great. Thanks, Nicole. And yes, I've just popped a link in the chat in case anyone wants to see that Infrastructure Australia report. So the next question, will the recent ISSB/IFRS S2 draft amendments that propose easing for finance emissions in Scope 3 impact us here in Australia? I assume this doesn't impact built environment. It was discussed a lot at the recent AICD Climate Governance Forum, and would love to know your thoughts. So Alison or Nicole, one of you, feel free to take that one away.
I feel like this is a standoff with both people not wanting to answer the question.
You're talking now, Nicole. So
yeah, I'm talking, so I guess I'll continue. Look, I don't know this in detail. So the standards for reporting are governed by the AASB, the Australian Accounting Standards Board in Australia. Let's just assume that Scope 3 reporting for financed emissions was taken off the table. Financed emissions is about what you're investing into, but actually calculating the emissions of buildings still has to get reported in a different Scope 3 category. So category 1, the purchase goods and services would still get that, not for, say, the bank or the investor, but rather for the builder. So it would still come up, but not necessarily in finance, depending on where the rules land in Australia. And I'm not aware where that's going to land yet. Sorry, Dominique, I don't have a better answer for you than that at this stage.
And thanks. And Dominique, I think what I would say probably is, I think, how we said, everyone's scopes, Scope 1 and 2 could be someone else's Scope 3. Potentially the companies that producing materials in Australia that are manufacturing, they will start to need to look at, reducing Scope 1 and 2. I think from our perspective, we just wanted to ensure that the built environment could reward and incentivize that, looking at reducing Scope 1 and 2 of our value chain, our supply chain, and what are some really good levers that can, result in the win-win? So, having people demand the low carbon materials so that they can be invested in. So not particularly around the financing, but at least just looking at the levers to drive behaviours.
And that's actually going to be really important because a lot of our building products that we use in Australia are actually imported and may or may not come under the same regulation that the ones do here for reporting. So important that we're actually drawing that data in regardless of where they're coming from.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. We've just got one more question, which I'll throw out and then we'll wrap up. So just wondering if we can go back to the roots. Is there any particular standard or policy or intervention for measuring embodied carbon right from the start to the end of a project? As this is the stage where most emissions lie, considering the transportation and processing of materials. This seems to be mostly ignored when it comes to practical incorporation in regards to on-site consideration. Is there any studies or case studies particularly measuring that construction stage embodied carbon? So yeah, I'll leave that as a free-for-all question. I feel like either of you could answer that one. So yeah.
Do you want to go first?
No, you go for it, Alison.
Happy to. Thanks. All I can say is, yes, there are standards out there. I know, when I talked about the gap between the ASBEC policy paper and comprehensive policy framework, so much policy from government was released. And from an infrastructure perspective, they pointed to PAS 2080, so a publicly available specification produced in the UK. That is, can't remember the name, but it's something like carbon management across buildings and infrastructure. And that looks at all of the opportunities you can do to reduce carbon at every single stage of an asset lifecycle. So there are standards out there. That is a carbon management standard, so that helps you make the right decisions at the right time. There are also other standards, and Nicole is very well versed with this, and you can probably talk into it around the life cycle analysis. So I might pass to you, Nicole.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the biggest moves that's happened in the Australian built environment for embodied carbon is that NABERS now has published a rating tool for the upfront carbon of buildings. So again, we're talking about modules A1 to A5 in the standards speak. So talking about from raw materials, transport, manufacture, transport to a construction site, and construction emissions, all of that together. So all the way up to practical completion. NABERS now has a rating tool for that. It is out. The rules are public. They're freely available to everyone. And so is their calculator. And we're really encouraging people, at least use that methodology. Even if you don't get a NABERS rating, use that methodology. The infrastructure bodies are also using basically the same methodology. So Australia is falling into alignment behind that methodology. And the reason for that is it was really heavily consulted, and we got massive stakeholder agreement to the methodology. So that's why everyone's falling in behind it. I'm just going to jump to the next question. EPDs being used by ASBEC as a means of identifying A1 to A5 carbon and certification? Absolutely. The ASBEC paper that Alison just referred to pointed out EPDs and verified carbon footprints. So we want to make sure that it is trustworthy, that it's aligned with the standards, so that A1 to A5 is critical. But yeah, EPDs are the gold standard for how to develop and publish that kind of info.
Perfect. Awesome. And we just have, I know I said this before, but we do have one last question now. I think if either of you are happy to answer it. It's more of a sentiment really, I suppose. But it's, to achieve big cuts quickly, it seems like the focus should be on 4 and policy level 1, maybe. Not that 2 and 3 aren't important.
4 and policy level 1, I gather.
Yes, I believe so.
So this is the design, the design and planning stage. Absolutely right, David. The opportunities there are immense. And not only that, very, very much aligned with circularity principles. So it's about understanding, what do I need to do to build sufficiently? Or, I'm trying to house X many people. How do I do that in a way that it considers the use of resources in a much better way, or the reuse, or the sweating the assets? So very much good on you for embracing circularity, because that recommendation is very much around circularity thinking.
Awesome. Well, that brings us to the end of the webinar. I just want to take another minute to thank Alison and Nicole for coming on today and talking about all things ASBEC and the embodied carbon work that has been done. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and see you next time.
We have many more webinar replays on a whole host of sustainability topics. You can check them out on our website and our YouTube channel.